everybody. I hope you're all ready for chapter 3. Just have a quick recap. If you remember, the children were all lined up outside and their nutty teacher, Mrs. Peacock, had said they were going to get changed into their swimming things outside the classroom. They were all a little bit shocked. So let's read on. This is called Locked In, chapter 3. The line of children snaked noisily around the corner of the building and along one side. Mrs. Peacock led the way, her whistle swinging on a length of green string around her neck. Ben couldn't understand why nobody was asking any questions. Joe Rimmer, why wasn't he shouting out? Ben looked behind him and saw Joe laughing with Nathan. They were both taking giant strides, catching the heels of the children in front with each step. Nobody else seemed to think it was funny that Mrs. Peacock had said they were going to get changed outside. Or perhaps they were just so excited that there was a change of plan that they didn't want to remind Mrs. Peacock that this was not a normal day. Mrs. Peacock stopped by the classroom window and turned to face the children. She blew the whistle once, so quietly that Ben thought it was Danny, through that gap in his teeth. "Children," said Mrs. Peacock, and Ben noticed that strange, excited look again. "Get yourselves changed as quickly as possible. Leave your towels in your bags and put your bags behind the drain pipe. Look!" She grabbed a bag, screwed it up as tightly as she could, and pushed it behind the drain pipe. "You see?" she said. "Or rather, you don't see." She began to laugh loudly, a bit madly, Ben thought, like the monster in his reading book that couldn't stop laughing and ended up exploding with a huge bang. Ben felt a strange, worrying feeling building up in his tummy. He was beginning to wish it was a normal day and he was doing circle time. "Right, I need a monitor," said Mrs. Peacock when she had stopped laughing. Ben was relieved that she hadn't exploded. His hand shot up in the air and he stood on tiptoe. Mrs. Peacock looked at the sea of stiffly waving hands and beckoned to Ben. He walked proudly past Jake and Abby and Joe and Kimberly and stood looking up at Mrs. Peacock. She bent to whisper in his ear, "I want you to go into school, walk quietly up to Mrs. Craven's office and close her door. Turn the key in the lock. Don't let her see you." Ben stared at Mrs. Peacock. She was staring back at him. He swallowed and nodded. He could tell this was a really important job. He wanted to do it, but he was a bit worried about doing it on his own. Mrs. Craven was the head teacher. You didn't lock the head teacher in her room. What if she saw him before he could turn the key? What if she wasn't in her office but outside it, telling off that horrible Ryan who was always in trouble? "Can I take someone with me?" he whispered. But Mrs. Peacock had already turned away and was trying to pull Abby's swimming cap onto her head. For once, Ben was glad that Jake never did as he was told, at least first time. Jake was still in his school uniform, chatting to Joe. They were swinging their trunks around above their heads and making silly monkey faces. "Jake," hissed Ben, "come on, we've got an important job to do." Jake didn't usually get important jobs. He wasn't to be trusted, Mrs. Peacock said. The two boys left their swimming things by the wall and walked importantly towards the front entrance of the school. Ben was beginning to enjoy this now. Mrs. Peacock might be nutty as a fruitcake, but this was better than literacy. Ben turned to face Jake and put his finger to his lips. Then he bent over and began to tiptoe up the corridor. Jake immediately followed, 2 paces behind. This was fun. It was like playing army where you had to sneak up on the enemy. As Ben approached the office, he lowered his head like some sort of strange beast so that Mrs. Brooks, the school clerk, wouldn't see him through the hatch. He could hear the tap-tap of her keyboard as he crept along, close to the wall. He could feel Jake's breath on the back of his neck, and for the second time that morning, he shivered with excitement. Ben and Jake had lowered themselves onto their bellies by the time they reached the door to Mrs. Craven's office. They were soldiers, on manoeuvres, Ben said. Jake wasn't sure what that meant, but it sounded good. The door was slightly open, and Jake could hear Mrs. Craven on the phone. "Yes," she was saying. "I understand that, Mrs. Peters, but Ryan really can't go round doing these things. To other children, there have to be consequences." Ben didn't know what consequences were, but they sounded bad. He hoped they were. He eased himself up off the floor, making sure he remained behind the door. Jake did the same. The two boys looked at each other and grinned. Ben reached across and clutched the key sticking out of the lock. It was smooth and cool against his palm. He heard the ping of the phone as Mrs. Craven replaced the receiver. In one swift move, Ben pushed the door closed and turned the key firmly in the lock until he heard a satisfying click. And that's the end of chapter 3. I wonder what's going to happen next. It's all quite exciting, isn't it? I hope you listen again tomorrow, and thanks for listening today. See you soon. Bye.